I just want to welcome everybody. My name is Michael Wexler. I'm the Associate Director here at the Institute of Jewish Spirituality and Society. Should move my notes over to here. The Institute, just a note on the Institute, our mission, what we do is advance scholarship and social transformation. We focus mostly on, we focus on a number of things: academic ideas, scholarly ideas, intellectual ideas, really with the focus of bringing ancient spiritual knowledge to bear on the challenges that we have today in modern society. And we have this Verbringen series, which is something we do monthly. Verbringen is a word that means coming together of like-minded souls, if you will. So that's where we are right now. We want to welcome you, and today we have two great guests with us who are gonna speak and have a conversation, and everybody will then have a chance to get into the conversation. So first, I want to introduce the gentleman who's on the screen with me. Ariel Evan Mays is an assistant professor of religious studies at Stanford University and rabbi in residence of Atik, if I'm saying it right, Jewish Maker Institute, and the senior scholar in residence at the Institute of Jewish Spirituality and Society. He's the author of Laws of the Spirit, Ritual, Mysticism, and the Commandments in Early Hasidism, Speaking Infinites, God and Language in the Teachings of Rabbi Dov Bar of Metzrich. I said that well, right? And together with Arthur Green, A New Hasidism, Roots, and A New Hasidism, Branches. So some very esteemed fellows here today, and I want to turn it over to Ariel, who will take it from here.
Thanks, Michael. Really appreciate that. Wonderful to be here together with everyone, some new friends, some old friends, some friends yet to be. Really lovely. It's a great pleasure to have with us today my longtime friend and colleague, Professor Don Seeman. Don's an anthropologist who holds joint appointments in religion and in the Tam Institute for Jewish Studies at Emory University. All of his wonderful scholarship, from his ethnography of Ethiopian Israelis to his many textual studies of Maimonides and of Hasidism during the Holocaust, is motivated by an attempt to understand and describe the existential context and meaning of religious experience in all of its many forms. Don is the founding co-chair of the Emory Forum for the Ethnographic Study of Religion. He served as the co-editor of Contemporary Anthropology of Religion book series at Palgrave Macmillan, and serves on the editorial boards of numerous journals. He promotes a truly interdisciplinary approach to the ethnographic and textual study of religion, and his most recent work is called Between Life and Thought, Existential Anthropology and the Study of Religion, a marvelous co-edited volume, and that's part of what we'll be hearing about today. So without further ado, Don, I'm going to hand the floor over to you. We look forward to hearing your remarks, then we'll engage in a conversation and we'll throw open the doors to all.
Thank you very much, Ariel and Michael. There's a rabbinic phrase that I don't get to use very much in my academic life, which is matchilim b'chvod achsanya, which means you should begin with a few words of praise for the hosts. I have many words of praise for the hosts. First of all, Professor Ariel Mays from Stanford, is one of the few academic writers today that I really and truly do enjoy reading. And that's because, in part, I think that the things that he writes about in Hasidism and Jewish mysticism, and ecology for that matter, are things that he cares about and are not just intellectual topics for him. And this has been a difficult year, I think, for many of us in Jewish studies-related academia and for many Jews outside of academia. And Ariel really for years has been a lifeline for me of friendship and collegiality. So thank you for the invitation. Michael Wexler, I don't know as well personally, but he will take it as a compliment when I mention that his father, Philip Wexler, who began this conversation about mysticism and sociology, or mysticism and social science, was really a unique person and a unique scholar who I met by accident at an event at the Hebrew University, sponsored by Chabad, and later I invited him to Emory to speak at a conference on anthropology and religion that I was hosting. And Philip Wexler really tried to reorient the study of sociology to account for the kinds of realities that religious people talk about and that mystics talk about, but for which no good social science vocabulary exists. And that's a difficult proposition. And it forced him sometimes, and it will force me sometimes, to use language in ways that may not be immediately apparent to you. But I promise, if not my work, if you take a look at Philip Wexler's work and read it carefully, it will reward you. Because here is somebody wrestling with some of the great problems of our time and trying to bring to bear not only Jewish insights, Hasidic insights, and mystical insights into a language of descriptive sociology that doesn't know how to describe those things at all because they're not sociological categories. Just as one example I'll mention to you, Judaism is generally not well described in academic scholarship, neither in Jewish studies or elsewhere, but especially elsewhere, because there's a need that scholars feel to put things into the categories that they use for everything else. So you can talk about religion, you can talk about ethnicity, you can talk about race, you can talk about nationality, but somehow none of those are really adequate to describe Jewishness. And if you think that that's just a sterile scholarly debate, think about the fact that all of the arguments and conversations that we've been having about anti-Semitism this year and anti-Semitism in the academy twirl around this subject. What is a Jew? And when do Jews have a right to feel as if something is being directed against them as Jews? When somebody else may say, well, no, Judaism is a religion and I'm talking about a nationality, or Judaism is a nationality and I'm talking about a race, or Judaism is a race and I'm talking about a religion, and so forth and so on. We don't have good language for something that is simultaneously a religion and a race and an ethnicity and a nationality and a connection of some kind that people find hard to articulate. There is one Hebrew word that you could use, but it's not a sociology word. And that word is brit, or covenant, which has connected to it all of these pieces. Covenant is something you enter into that is passed down through your generations to your children and your children's children. So it's not just a religious belief. It comes with certain kinds of commitments. In the Jewish case, we understand it as commitments to do mitzvot, to love God, one's fellow, and so forth and so on. And it's a nationality in the sense that throughout history, Jews referred to themselves and were referred to by others as a nation. And that nation is not exactly coterminous with the state of Israel, but it's certainly bound up in the state of Israel and can't be separated from it. And so there are layers and layers of complexities here that scholars can argue about from here till tomorrow if they cared to argue about it. But these are immediate existential concerns for those of us who feel at odd ends, especially right now in the months since October 7th. Let me start by just saying that there are two basic ways in which scholars have thought about religion. And I'm going to argue that they're both wrong, but they're really the only two ways that scholars have had to talk about religion, and I want to suggest what they are. Okay, one is something that scholars sometimes call perennialism. It's a big word. You don't need to know the word. What it means is that there's a single unchanging core of true religious experience, often associated with mysticism. And it may take forms embodied by Judaism or Christianity or Buddhism or Islam or what have you, even secular forms of mysticism. But at heart, scholars have argued that this is really the same thing. It's a core capacity of what it is to be a human being. And up through the 1950s, even 60s, maybe even a little later, most of the academic study of religion focused on this kind of material. People searching for the single common denominator that would help them to understand all religions and unpack them. And invariably, it was more closely represented by certain forms of Christianity, Protestant Christianity, than other religious traditions, because mysticism in this sense is about feelings and ideas and experiences, and it doesn't require doctrines, rituals, practices, kinship, all of the other things that richly characterize many of our religious traditions, including Judaism. And so in 19th and early 20th century religious studies, there was almost a sense, and sometimes it was literal, that Judaism was an inferior example of religious life. And of course, Christianity and Protestant Christianity and certain forms of Protestant Christianity were the ideal. But Judaism got lost in its rituals and in its persistent conceptions of peoplehood that removed it from the universal. And if that sounds like an old kind of Christian critique of Judaism, of course it is, but it was adopted into the secular study of religion in the academy and continued almost unchanged until the second part of the 20th century. So that's perennialism. That's a sense that religion is about mysticism. Mysticism is about particular kinds of experiences that transcend language and any words you use to express them, whether it's in Hebrew or Latin or Greek or English, doesn't matter. But everybody is circling around the same set of ideas, trying to express them. Now, this view is still quite common out in the world when you talk to people, but it's lost ground in the academy. And ever since the 70s, and with increasing force, certainly in departments of religion like mine and Ariel's and many others, the paradigm has changed to a completely different one, which is called cultural or sociological constructionism, or constructionism for short. Constructionism is an idea that there is no single, universal, perfect mysticism out there. What there are different religions with different languages and historical traditions. And in fact, this view claims that the only way we know anything about anything is through language. And so therefore, we can't say anything about religious experience. In some of the more extreme cases, they say that the word religion or the word mysticism is itself a misnomer, fake news, because it purports to describe things that are wildly different. Forms of Buddhism that don't have a supreme being, and forms of Judaism that are monotheistic, and forms of Christianity that are this or that. How could those all flow under one banner, under one rubric? And so what religion scholars have done more and more is to limit themselves to the detailed questions of what words mean, of what a particular language means, and how to read it in a specific historical context. Okay, oddly enough, one of the pioneers of this way of looking at things was Stephen Katz, who was himself, and I've spoken with him about this, very influenced by Gershom Scholem, the scholar of Jewish mysticism, in formulating this idea. So already there you see these categories don't exactly stay separate. Mysticism and constructionism are somehow related to each other. But Scholem, Gershom Scholem, who founded the study of Jewish mysticism in the academy, was a historical philologist. He studied the history of language. That's really, really what he did. And he found texts and he read them and he was incredible. But the idea that hiding behind all of these words and texts and meanings is some sort of living heart of human experience is something that he pushed away from to some degree. People will argue with me about that. That's fine. And something that the contemporary academy has more or less pushed away from entirely. So that if you're a scholar of Judaism today in the academy, not only is there no expectation that Judaism is something that you appreciate or commit to or live in conversation with personally, which is fine. You can have scholars studying things, studying religious traditions that they're not members of. But you have the sense that really all there is language and the meanings of words and terms and how they fit together, and that's what we should study. And on some level, that has led to the opposite of what perennialism led to. Perennialism was sloppy because it said all religions are the same and let's find the common core. Mahatma Gandhi famously said all religions are different paths to a single truth, which he, of course, felt that he could conveniently convey to us. On the other hand, constructionists say there's no there there. There's no there there. And the truth is, if many of them had their way, there wouldn't even be departments of religion, because religion is a chimera. It's not a category that actually coheres. All we have are different traditions that talk themselves. So we have these two major trends in the academic study of religion. Now, if I've lost you so far, that's fine, but just come back to the following key point, which is that in the academic study of religion, you can either think that everything is the same, or you can think that everything is different. Most of us in the real world don't walk around that way. Not about religion and not about other things. We sort of recognize that we live in a world with other people. We can communicate with them. Even if we don't know their language, we could learn their language. And the things that they describe and the things that they experience are not exactly the same as the things that I experience, maybe. But there's enough overlap that with a little work, I can understand people. And the danger of constructivism today in the academy is that together with certain kinds of political developments, it's eating away at the very idea that people can talk to and understand one another and speak across boundaries, without which really the whole liberal project, I think, is fated to demise. Okay, now, where do I come into this story? I don't have a PhD in religion. I don't have a PhD in Jewish studies, although I teach in a department of religion and in a program of Jewish studies. Like Philip Wexler, I have a degree in social science. He was a sociologist. I'm an anthropologist. And if you ask what is the difference between a sociologist and an anthropologist, I will say on one foot that a sociologist hands out questionnaires and the anthropologist invites himself over for dinner. It's a less formal or less numerical, quantitative kind of field. And in anthropology, we learn by trying to enter the contexts of people's everyday lives. And it's called participant observation, because you're both participating and observing, or ethnography. But there's an idea that joining people in the spaces they inhabit, rather than framing them in some abstract way through beliefs or even doctrines or rituals, but coming down to the places where they live and seeing what the world looks like from there, can help us understand what it's like to be human in different ways. There's more than one way of being human. It's just that all of them have a lot in common. They don't have everything in common, but they have a lot in common. How do I know this? Because any human being is capable, in principle, of learning any other human language. And even before I've learned your language, if you drop me down in your village, if you don't eat me before I have a chance, I can enter into communication with you, even if it's just a communication of gestures. I can explain to you that I'm hungry, and you know what hunger is because you're a human being, unless you're hiding it from yourself. Now, people who do terrible things to other human beings often are engaged in that kind of hiding. They say, those people don't have souls, so they don't experience what I'm experiencing. They don't experience hunger. They don't experience pain because of who or what they are. And anthropology fundamentally, on some level, rejects that, or at least the kind of anthropology that I practice. Okay, now, you with me so far? Okay. Ariel is nodding along. That's good enough. So anthropology has also fallen into these traps of perennialism and constructivism. And so there were anthropologists early in the century who tried to find the core constituents of humanity, that all people are the same, right? And minimize difference. And then there's the more common form of anthropology, again, since the 60s and 70s, that emphasized cultural difference between people from different groups, almost to the extent that they shouldn't be able to understand one another because they live in different worlds. There was a famous anthropologist named Schwader from University of Chicago. He called this form of anthropology, nicely enough, polytheistic anthropology. What he meant by that is, and he meant it as a compliment in that context. He was not gearing up to hew down their altars. But what he meant by that was people who have different languages live in different worlds, and they don't experience the world the same way as one another. And therefore, if you're an Orthodox Jew, there really is a boundary at a certain point beyond your house after the Sabbath that is metaphysical, that you can't cross. And if you're a Hindu, purity and impurity are real. The gods are real, but they're only real for you. They're not real for me. The problem with this view is that even though it allows us to be open and accepting of different people, right? It prevents us from feeling like we have all the truth to ourselves. But if you think about it, at some moment, it requires that we are so different from whoever we are so different from whomever it is we're talking to or talking about, that it's as if we can't understand one another. I once was on the subway in New York years ago. Nelson Mandela was visiting New York, and I saw some teenagers with shirts that said, "You just wouldn't understand the Black experience, the African-American experience." Now, on some level, that's of course true, because I haven't lived that life. But at the same time, the idea that it has nothing in common with my experience, whether as a Jew or not, the idea that through an active imagination, I cannot even begin to think my way into that with good faith and work, is the antithesis of what it means to be able to come together with people in a political community. So before we even get to the problems of academics, I want to suggest that the demise of the humanities and of many of our fields in the academy today is symptomatic of failures of imagination that will make it very hard for us to live together and not only to study together. The ethnographer, the anthropologist, invites himself to dinner. And that is a crucial moment, because at that moment, a few things happen. First of all, you put yourself at the mercy of the other. You're asking for their hospitality, and that puts you at a disadvantage. Maybe you don't know the language. Maybe you don't know the rules of propriety. I'm working on a book now that talks about my early experiences of doing anthropology in the Ethiopian Jewish community. And there's one story that I came back to. I had just arrived in Israel. I was a college senior working on a senior thesis in anthropology. And I went to Upper Nazareth, Nazareth Elite, to meet Ethiopians to talk to. And somehow or other, I got myself invited to somebody's house. That's a longer story. But it was one of the first people I had met. And as I sat there talking to him and his family, my Hebrew was broken, their Hebrew was broken. He kept on pouring orange soda into my cup. And I would drink it out of a sense of, at first, I was thirsty, but then I was just trying to be a good guest, and I would drink it, and then he would refill it. I would drink it, and he would refill it, and it went on that way, and I couldn't get him to stop. Why? Because I didn't know the rule that when I had enough, I was supposed to put my hand over the cup and say, "Baka, enough." And then, like a good host, he would stop trying to force it on me. But we were both prisoners of our misconceptions. He had to keep pouring, and I had to keep drinking. We had to learn something about each other. Now, the custom of continually filling the guest's cup is not like such a deep symbolic thing. People from any society can understand what that is, that moment of hospitality. But it follows different rules. If you're an Ethiopian refugee, if you're in German high society, if you're a professor at Stanford, there are different rules for how these things go, but we can intuitively understand what hospitality is because we're humans first. Maybe because we're mammals or primates or something like that, but I'm not even going to extend it that far. We're human beings, and therefore the fundamental things about life, even when you understand it completely differently, there's a core of understanding that we can work towards by being there together, by sharing life. Now, when you share life, after a while, you become less fixated on culture or difference or religious construction, and you become less focused also on abstract things that you think all human beings share, because that's very abstract. And if you're lucky, what you become focused on are the day-to-day experiences of different people in different settings, in different worlds that I can intuitively grasp. I can intuitively grasp to some degree, imperfectly. I would never claim that I can live your experience. I can't step into your shoes. But I can come closer than I was before. And that's the work that an anthropologist, in my view, should be doing. That doesn't mean that's what they all do. That's what they should be doing. Okay, now, before I shut my mouth and let Ariel ask me some questions, let me just bring this back to the study of mysticism and Jewish mysticism in particular, because I suppose that's what this crowd is interested in, and I'm interested in. When you write about mysticism as a believer, so you can write about how God appears to you, or what the soul is like and what it's doing, or how we all stood together on Mount Sinai to receive the revelation. And those are all perfectly fine and true things to talk about from the perspective of that faith, that tradition. And Christians believe something else, and Muslims believe something else. And I certainly don't expect that they will adhere to what I think is true, and I don't expect to adhere to what they think is true. We each speak our own language. But now, for whatever foolish reason, I want to describe my way of religious life for somebody who either does experience it but doesn't have words to articulate it, or wants to understand it more systematically, or is coming from a completely different place. My bedrock faith, my shahada, is that it is possible for people to express themselves in ways that will be comprehensible to other people within limits. That I can describe what it means to be a Sabbath observant Jew, not perfectly, but enough so that somebody else can get the gist of it. And furthermore, that if you look closely enough in a particular way, you'll find that my Sabbath observance or kashrut or other things that I do as a Jew are not only things that I do as a Jew, and they're not necessarily reflections of some universal grand truth, but what they are is, among other things, responses to problems that people face. The problems that people face are much more similar, perhaps, than the ways that they answer those problems. I'll give you a very simple example. Every single society on the planet, I don't care who they are, what they believe, how many genders they have, every single society on the planet has to deal with the problem of the continuity of society as people die. People die, other people take their place, we age, we get sick, we have children. Those are physiological features of humanity that are true in China, and they're true in Japan, and they're true in Atlanta. They're true everywhere. The idea that people leave and people come is a fundamental human concern. Every single society on the planet, and I will say this recorded, you can go try to prove me false. Every single group of people on the planet has to deal with this problem of continuity. Now, The halakha of Judaism has a way of formulating that problem and dealing with it. It has to do with who passes down their inheritance to whom, and how religious and other kinds of social identity are passed on. Is it through the mother, tribal identity through the father, through conversion, circumcision, whatever it is? Those are not the same as the things that Buddhists do. Jews put a lot of emphasis on marriage and children. Buddhists also get married and have children. But it's a little less articulated in terms of core elements of their theology. But nevertheless, they have to deal with the same problem that I do. And they may have other ways of doing it through discipleships, through people becoming monks for part of their lives and then becoming householders or whatever it is. There's almost an infinite number of ways to think about how to solve the problem of continuity. But the problem is a human universal. So when I talk about human universals, I don't mean something we all believe or we all do or something that's true in exactly the same way for everyone. I mean that all of us are thrown into this world in similar ways. We're born into a society that pre-exists, that makes demands upon us. We grow up, we learn those things. Sometimes we try to break free of them. Sometimes we don't. We're all mortal. We will all die. We all need to eat. And this creates certain kinds of universal themes that individual cultures, languages, religions try to answer. Not only do we need to eat, but as the Jewish tradition says, Lo al lechem levado yicheh ha'adam, we don't live only by bread. We need society. We need other people. We need the solace of friends, of family, of intimacy of different kinds. All people need that. But how they organize that, and whether they think that anybody can marry anybody, or only certain classes of people can get married, or every child is inheritance from the parents in the same way, or certain classes of, that's all negotiable. The reason that Ariel asked me here is because I recently co-edited a book with a title that is not comprehensible. But the subtitle is Existential Anthropology and the Study of Religion. And that's what I've just described to you. Anthropology is the opportunity to meet people where they are, participate with them in their lives, and try to learn from them. Existentialist means living in the moment and trying to understand the problems that people face right now. Not to the exclusion of culture, not to the exclusion of theology, not to the exclusion of anything else we might want to know about people, but to understand those things as much as we can in the context of problems we all share. I'll let it rest there and we'll have a conversation and I'll answer questions. I encourage people to read the book. If you don't want to read the whole book, by the way, 2 chapters. Read the first chapter by my colleague, Devika Primawardana. He gives a theoretical introduction to this subject that is excellent. And you can read my chapter if you want, which is the last chapter, which deals with anti-Semitism in France and in anthropology after the war. And I'm happy to talk about that in questions and answers. Okay.
Thank you so much, Don. That was a really wonderful, thoughtful, and deeply personal exploration of some of the themes that we've been in dialogue about for so many years, and I think are really at the forefront of your work and certainly of our ethical moment these days. Your last quip about reading the book reminded me of something that one of my graduate teachers when I was in grad school always used to say, I don't require my students to read my books, I just require that they buy them. You're the opposite, which befits your generous soul. I want to pick up on a couple of threads that you've begun. A word that you didn't use a lot or at all in this in your remarks is the question of comparison. Reading between the lines, I think what you've said is that the interpretive work and the experiences of anthropology, which begin with the what is rather than the abstraction, and the possibility of communication really has moral, ethical, and you would say also existential implications. I think that's really wonderful. Something you've pointed out in writing and we've spoken about over the years is that cramped definitions of academic terms, of theories, of ways of being in the world limit our modes of thinking, but they also limit our ability to communicate across differences. I think that's a wonderful point, and I think it's a really, really important one. So focusing that on the question of Hasidism, on the question of Jewish mysticism, not the subject of your paper in this book, but something that you've thought about so much over the decades, I'd like to ask why you study Hasidism, how you study Hasidism, its conceptions of the world, its conceptions of self, and what are those implications, or rather, what are the implications of that mode of thinking and being in the world for us who don't study Hasidism or live outside of a Hasidic community? What have you found there that is so interesting, important, useful, challenging?
So I'll start with a story, of course. The philosopher Martin Buber is one of the important philosophers of the 20th century, and one of the people who first wrote about Hasidism for a Western audience, by the way. He published Tales of the Hasidim in German. He later made Aliyah, and his life was saved because he grew up in Germany, and he spent his last years teaching at the Hebrew University, where, by the way, he taught in the Department of Sociology, not because he was a sociologist, but because they had no place else to put him. The Jewish studies people didn't want him. The philosophers didn't want him. They said, let's create a department of sociology and we'll give it to him. And that's what they did. And I taught in that department for a good few years, and his name never came up, which was full of chagrin for me. But Martin Buber, as a young man, became interested in the study of mysticism. Now, what he meant by mysticism, and I think there's echoes of this in Sholem as well, is that if you imagine a world in which the earthly and the divine have been separated, they've been cast asunder. God is here, you're there. That's a world of a certain kind of loneliness. And mysticism comes as a response to that, to bridge that gap, to create ladders between heaven and earth, to use Bob Orsi's language. And that's a very powerful model. But it assumes that the godly, divine, religious, whatever mystical level that you want to, right, really is not naturally connected to the humble goings on of what in medieval terms they call the sublunary world, right? The down here, the world that we inhabit. Buber tells a story that a student once came to talk to him about a personal problem, and he was busy. He was, I don't know if he was meditating, what he was doing, but he was busy, and he told the student, get back to me tomorrow. And the student committed suicide that night. And Buber had a powerful response to this. And he said he was giving up mysticism as a practice, as a concern. And ultimately, he became what we call an existentialist, someone who lives in the moment, who's always asking the question, what now? What is my life about now? Do I wake up this morning? Do I go to sleep? Do I kill myself, right? Those are existential questions. And he shifted his life and his concern and his career. And he wrote other kinds of books after that, not Tales of the Hasidim, but I and Thou and stuff like that. I want to posit that the distinction that Buber was making between mysticism and existentialism is an unnecessary distinction in the following sense. And in a way, I've learned this from Hasidism. So hopefully that makes Rabbi Schmidt happy. But I learned this from Hasidism. There's a famous book about Hasidism that you and I both know, Ariel, that begins with the outlandish statement that the answer of Hasidism to humanity's existential questions is no. In other words, this author posits, she's no longer among the living, but this author posits that because Hasidism is interested in mysticism and in the other worlds, and right, that therefore it has no interest in problems of human suffering, problems of the everyday. How will I earn my bread? Even when we pray, say certain Hasidic writers, we're not thinking about our needs, which is a more existential way of thinking about prayer. We're thinking only about the divine. And therefore, our human needs sort of vanish. And she made that into a core of her statement on Hasidism as mysticism. It does not respond to human existential problems at all. It's just not its concern. Now, aside from the fact that it's hard for me to imagine how any long-lasting religious phenomenon that has lasted hundreds of years and held the attention of hundreds of thousands of people could possibly say, I have no interest in human concerns or problems. But leave that aside. Take a tradition like Chabad, which I know is close to some of your hearts. And if you look at Chabad Hasidism, whether as a scholar or as a practitioner or as a fellow traveler, you'll find that one of the key ideas in this Hasidic movement that it talks about every place, you can't open a book without seeing this within a page or two, is the idea of bittul or bitul or nullification or self-nullification or self-annihilation, however you want to translate it. One famous rabbi said in a podcast that the correct translation of bitul is bitul. No way to translate it. Okay, so fine. Now, that seems like a proof for this author's claim. Because if my whole religious life is geared to the extinction of myself and my ego, then how could it possibly relate to my everyday problems? Okay, so there's something logical that seems correct about that. However, when you talk to Hasidim, and even when you learn Hasidic texts, when you read the classical texts, it's just that's not how it works. It's not true. The idea of bittul is a mystical idea, the annihilation of ego, but it's not only that. It's also an ethical principle that's routinely invoked to describe how I need to take up less space to allow somebody else to take up some space of their own, how I should be allow myself to be overruled by people greater than I am, by the Rebbe or by the people who know Torah or whatever. It's a ritual category that talks about how I keep my kitchen kosher, okay? How I avoid eating chametz on Passover by bittul, by nullification of small quantities, which, by the way, even in its ritual context, doesn't mean non-existence. It means unimportance. In other words, I look at something in a slightly different way. So now I say, oh, so the little drop of milk that fell into my meat soup, tiny drop, tiny. We say less than 1 in 60. But what we really mean is it's a tiny drop. It's inconsequential. Can't taste it. Doesn't exist. Doesn't exist practically. Of course it exists. And so scholars of mysticism who have gotten hung up on this claim that somehow, humanity can annihilate itself and what does that mean? They're missing the point that mystical conversation is continuous with a whole host of different kinds of languages that are everyday languages of how I interact with other people, how I interact with my kitchen, with my food. It has theological contexts. It has legal context. It has ethical context. It's not, as some people would say, like, oh, so they took a ritual word and now they're using it for mysticism. At least I don't believe that. I think rather, the term bittul has all of these different significances. And when you use it in any one of them, it reverberates with all of the others. And so bittul doesn't mean self-annihilation in the sense of, I'm going to go kill myself. I'm going to erase myself. It doesn't even mean I will sit and meditate and forget about the cares of the world. It means something different. It means that I'm able to turn my attention away from myself at certain key points, so I become less important. Now, subsequently, one of the things I realized, and this is a book that I hope to publish in Ariel's series, but one of the things I realized is that maybe this is a fundamental capacity of human beings, whoever they are, that relates to language. In other words, the ability to speak to anybody in the kind of language that we use requires, and I'm not making this up, other people have written about this, requires that I can turn attention away from the speaker in certain kinds of crucial ways and pay attention to you, what you're thinking, what you're saying, use language that's not always I focused, but he or she or they, or right? And that kind of turning away from self-attention is what I would say is the universal core that is then articulated in a special way in Hasidism. And it's articulated in different ways in different places with more or less emphasis. Okay, I have a friend who's a Chabad Hasid, and he gets frustrated with me because I'm not a Chabad Hasid, although I am what I would call a fellow traveler. But I one day made the mistake of saying to him that I didn't feel like I could attain the kind of bittul, the kind of self-nullification that that he, among other people, was in favor of. And one of my heroes, Rabbi Soloveitchik, used to talk all the time about the I, bringing your whole self to the service of God. And right? So, of course, now every time he has a little bit too much to drink, he sort of trots that out and yells at me for not being sufficiently nullified. But the truth is that I think that the Chabad tradition itself, from the earliest texts until any shliach, Rabbi Schmidt, I hope he won't be embarrassed, once told me a lovely story. That he worked for many years as the head of Chabad on campus. And as the head of Chabad on campus, you know what you do? You arrange events for other people, and you try to be invisible. And you stock the place with soda. Your soda, again, comes back to the heart of my story. And you let the event happen or the speaker speak or whatever. You don't try to get in the way. He said one time his son, I think it was asked in school what his father did for a living. They had, I don't know, parent profession day or something like that. And his child said to him, he schleps soda. Because in his mind, this incredibly important position as the head of Chabad's on campus was he schleps soda around. But that's true. And I think Rabbi Schmidt would say that himself. And because that's a kind of bittul. But it doesn't require the annihilation of self. It requires that I can turn myself away from my own immediate needs and think about my purpose, my task, what I'm doing for whomever else. And of course, we always have to regulate that against our ability to function as people in the world, to ask for what we need, to be there for people who love us, who don't want us to be clear glass, right? They want to talk to somebody and get a response. And so Chabad mysticism, like every other form of being human, focuses on some of these elements and prizes them. So, of course, it's different to be a Chabad Chassid than it is to be an Ishbitzer Chassid or a Litvak or whatever, or anything else. But it's not because they speak different languages that have nothing to do with one another, or because they're different kinds of people. It's because they have fundamental human concerns and fundamental human capacities that they focus on in unique, historically contingent ways. And so as an anthropologist, when I come to study Hasidism, so first of all, unlike people who only study texts, I often try to talk to people. But if they're alive, I have not yet talked to people who are not, but I try to talk to people who are alive. But even when I read the texts of people who are not alive or lived a long time ago, I read them, I think, differently than a lot of other people because I'm constantly trying to read them in the context of what human problems are they dealing with? What does this have to do with everything? And so there are things that are explicit in some of the texts that I noticed that other people I've spoken to just didn't notice. So the way in which bittul language, for example, is used in every possible conceivable context, right? The hand is bittul to the arm because the arm is what moves the hand, right? And the hearing is bittul to seeing because we believe what we see more than we hear. Right? And it comes up in a million different contexts, all of which are talking around certain kinds of key themes in this Hasidism, but they're also describing everyday experiences of human beings in the world. And the people who want to turn Hasidism into theology or philosophy, God forbid, have to ignore all of that because it doesn't fit the paradigm, right? So you take a Hasidic text which is written as in some contexts, a commentary on a Torah verse, or a talk between Rebbe and disciple, or even a mystical discourse that is all over the place. And it goes from here to there, and it's like walking around in the wilderness for 40 years before you get to the end of the Hemshech, and then you kind of maybe see where it began, right? But there's a reason it's written that way. It's not because they couldn't write clearly. It's because they were describing a movement, a mahalach. Things move, they change. Hasidism can't be a doctrine because it's attached to practices and to change over time, and to, as a person, me moving from here to there, sometimes back again, right? So somebody pulls out a statement that's talking that some Hasidic author said about Rosh Hashanah, and then they treat that as a doctrine of Hasidism. But what the text is actually describing is a moment in the life of a person observing Rosh Hashanah. It's not the same as Simchat Torah. It's not the same as Purim. And they're related to each other. But I think that the sensitivity that Victor Turner was a great anthropologist who was actually a convert to Catholicism, and there's something to say about that. And when he visited Israel, he went to Meron and Tzfat and jumped into all of the Hasidic minyanim and just functioned there. It was amazing. But he said the thing that people don't understand about ritual is that ritual is not an idea. It's a process. It takes place over time. And therefore, anytime you just say, okay, I'm going to look at it right now, so you're falsifying something about it, because it's moving, and the person or the people are moving with it. Human life is not static. And so when I think about Hasidic ideas, the reason I love Hasidism, and I loved it before I became an anthropologist, or at the same time I became an anthropologist, to me, they always seemed, I don't know, somehow related to one another. But the principle of movement is common to them both. The principle that a human being, a word, can't be precisely defined. Even a word can't be precisely defined. You know why? Because words exist in contexts of meaning. And so you've defined it. Very good. You have a definition. But the thing about human beings is we use words in infinite ways. We connect them in subtle ways to this word and to this context or that and therefore, if you're committed to a single definition, you miss the word. I could give you a dictionary definition of bittul, but it's incorrect because it means a whole host of different things, depending on how and when and where I use it. And that's true about everything in human life. So to me, the principle of movement and vitality and change, which is so much at the heart of Hasidism, even as opposed to other ways of thinking about being Jewish, is vital. And if I'll just one quick Dvar Torah, since why not? So the Meshiloach asks the question, which is more sacred, the temple that stood in Jerusalem, or the Mishkan, the tent of meeting that traveled around with the people in the desert? And most people would assume that the temple has greater sanctity because it's stone and marble, and it's beautiful, and it sits there forever at the place where God put it in Jerusalem. Meshiloach says, no, the Mishkan has a different or greater kind of holiness because it goes where the people go, and it goes where they need it to be. They don't come to it, it travels with them. And that, I think, is such an important insight about many, many, many things. This is what happens when somebody tells an academic, speak briefly about a topic.
Don, thank you so much. This has been really wonderful. Our time is almost up. There's a question from Michael in the chat about how you interpret and think about and metabolize and deal with the far out experiences that you find in Hasidic sources, everything from, I assume, the Baal Shem Tov's ascent unto the heavens and his discussions with the Messiah to, I guess, the most recent subspecies of that I know is Reb Zalman's description of his first acid trip in the 1960s, where he undergoes a journey not dissimilar to that of the Besht.
I can't help it. I'm a square. I never smoked pot. It didn't interest me. I forced myself to drink a little on Purim. So not everything speaks to me in the same way. There's a reason that I approach Hasidism in an intellectual vein rather than in a more emotional vein. That's why I'm comfortable with that. But for sure, there are these other aspects. I spent Shabbat in Zichron with some Hasidim of Rav Shlomo Carlebach one time. And before Kabbalat Shabbat, they had to pass around the reefer because you had to like be on the right spiritual madrega to experience it. That didn't speak to me. That's why there are a lot of different forms of Judaism and even a lot of different types of Hasidism. And to be perfectly honest, the ekstasa, the ecstasy that many even scholars talk about as part of Hasidism speaks less to me, if I'm just being personal, than what some forms of Hasidism, like Ishbitz, describe as Yishuv Hada'at, as kind of centeredness. I don't always have it, but that's an ideal that I resonate with more than the ideal of losing control or being in ecstasy. But that's fine because that's also part of the mystical life. In other words, it's not people. If people think that the mystical life is just vanishing from view and having ecstasy, I don't think that's true. And I think, by the way, that it's worth noting that when Chabad Torah talks about mystical experience, it tends to be very impersonal. This is what happens, then that happens. It doesn't say this is what I went through. This happened to me, usually. And that's a feature of Jewish mysticism in general, but it's particularly noteworthy in a school like Chabad that talks so much about metaphysics.
Mm-hmm.
But often, I think, depersonalizes it to make it intellectual, in other words, or as they would say, to make it something that the intellect can grasp, which is not to say that it's only intellectual, but that there's a way of talking about things that they were Litvaks at the end of the day, and they talked about things in abstract categories.
Don, thank you so much. As a way of bringing this to a close, two comments, if you'll permit me. One is that one of the great concerns that Philip Wexler wrote about many times throughout the course of his life is the question of a kind of post-secular world or a re-enchanted world. And I think one of the things that he felt so strongly is that what is often alleged by 20th century and often 21st century philosophers is that the world-denying elements of religion mandate a kind of secular, whether it's philosophy or even secular spirituality, in which the trappings of religion and its otherworldly preoccupations are left behind. That evidence really does not conform with what we see in the life-affirming and world-affirming message of Hasidism, which isn't the only message within Hasidism, but it's one that I think you've chosen to raise to our attention, and rightly so. It's also something that, as you noted, preoccupied Buber in all parts of his life. What's so interesting is that for the young Buber, who was an acolyte of Nietzsche and writes a really interesting eulogy for Nietzsche when he dies, for him, Hasidism was another kind of movement of spiritual rebellion that pointed out the mendacity of people's values and beliefs. That's what he says about Nietzsche. Then in his Erlebnis Mystique, his obsession with the experiential dimensions of mysticism, Hasidism is right there at the forefront of what Buber is thinking about. But just to close, I'd read something very briefly from an essay he writes in the 1940s after his dialogical, his existential turn. Buber
Buber,
writes
that is, not Philip Wexler.
no, it's called Love of God and Love of Neighbor. It's an essay from the early 1940s where he says as follows, that in Hasidism, the original intention of religious community is the realization of holiness in the whole breadth and fullness of the common life. The ethical is now no longer an affair between people authorized and sanctioned by religious authority, but it is no less than the religious in the narrower sense, an affair between people and God. The isolated religious element has disappeared here, even as the isolated ethical one. You cannot really love God if you do not love people, and you cannot really love people if you do not love God. So with that, I will say thank you to our illustrious speaker, Don Seeman. His book, his books are well worth reading, well worth getting. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us and share of your mind and of your heart with us this afternoon, this morning, this evening, wherever it is. To those of you who joined us, thank you so much for taking the time to do so. Please stay tuned. We'll have another of these events in July, many more coming in the fall, along with a range of other activities and classes. So please stay tuned and join me in thanking Professor Seeman.
Thank you very
Thank
much. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.